It's my pleasure to welcome you here to CG this evening. My name is Aaron Shull. I'm the Chief of Staff and General Counsel here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. It's not long ago that the terrorist attacks in Paris reminded us that the scourge of terrorism is still very real, and it's incumbent upon us to combat it in every way that we can. Tonight we're very fortunate to welcome Commodore Brian Santarpia, who's going to be speaking to us about the military efforts of the Canadian Navy to help combat terrorism in conjunction with a number of other nations on the high seas. And it's my job tonight to introduce our very, very distinguished speaker. Commodore Santarpia was enrolled in the Canadian Forces in 1986 as a maritime surface officer. After completing his training, he served on a number of different operational postings. He was a bridge watchkeeper, and actually in preparation for this introduction, I learned quite a bit about the different roles in the Navy. So there is something called a bridge watchkeeper. I wanted everyone to know that. He was also a navigator, a combat officer, an executive officer, and he served on a range of different ships, including the HMSC Halifax. Most recently, he was the commanding officer of the HMCS St. John's from January 2007 until July 2008. He's also been active in training other military officers and personnel. He was a navigation instructor. He also was the head of the Warfare Training Division at the Canadian Forces Fleet School. Following his promotion to captain in 2009, he was appointed as the special advisor to the Vice Chief of Defense Staff. In 2010, he assumed command of the Canadian Forces Base in Halifax until 2012. He's also very well educated. Aside from this I would say, wonderful experience in the Navy that's replete with both training and operational missions in every level of command, he was awarded a Bachelor of Commerce from Royal Roads University and a Master's of Defense Study from the Royal Military College. He was promoted to his current rank in July 2013 and was appointed as the Director General of Navy Personnel. And I suppose what brings us here tonight is that from December 2015 until April 2015, he was deployed to Bahrain, where he commanded the Combined Task Force 150, which is that multinational group of ships and aircraft that are actually out there conducting these counter-terrorism operations on the high seas. Upon his return to Canada, he was appointed to his current position as Chief of Staff to the Vice Chief of Defense Staff. So I think it kind of behooves me to say that I think we're very, very lucky to have such a distinguished speaker with someone with such worldly expertise to come and talk to us about such a pressing topic. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Commodore Brian Santarpia.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate that. Thank you. I really appreciate the introduction. We were joking at dinner, and I asked Aaron not to go through all that long list because it just shows I can't keep a job, is what I said. But that being aside, it's a great opportunity to come and speak to you. And the part of the introduction I appreciated the most was Aaron discussing why this is topical, why terrorism is still at front of mind for all of us. The attacks against Paris, the attack in Lebanon, the attack in Turkey, all those are very recent. And so it's not just in Western countries that we see these attacks going on every day, and it's important to note that all the countries of the world are facing this challenge, and that the way we react is in a lot of different ways. And so this talk, we've made this talk in a few different places across the country in the last little while. One, because it's important and topical now. Two, because it's important that Canadians, especially the well-informed Canadians like you are, understand what it is that we're doing on your behalf with your tax dollars and your sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. And three, because we're going to keep doing this kind of work. So this week, Australia will take command of this task force, and in their staff will be 7 Canadians, including the Deputy Commander, Captain Bill Quinn. So this work keeps going on. So it's important that the Canadians, particularly the well-informed Canadians like you, understand what it is we're doing on your behalf. Look at the next one here. So if you've ever heard of CTF 150, and many of you will have, because it shows up in the news every once in a while, the thing you hear about is drugs. Every once in a while, there's a big drug bust in the Indian Ocean. If that drug bust happens, it's usually done by a Canadian or an Australian ship. We just happen to be the best at doing that of all of our coalition partners. The drug busts are very large, hits the news, page 4 of the Globe or the National Post, and then it's gone, and you don't remember it. But they're very significant drug busts. This particular bust that you're looking at is over a ton of heroin. It's on the flight deck of Her Majesty's Canadian ship Toronto. They did this particular bust last year east of Africa in the Indian Ocean. And this is happening regularly. The numbers don't matter here at all. The important thing is the secular trend that's going up. And so more and more drugs are being interdicted in the Indian Ocean at sea, and there's a number of reasons why that's happening. The first of those reasons is that all of these drugs, all of this heroin and hash originates from the poppy fields in Afghanistan. And if you're tracking what's happened in Afghanistan, you know that it's not becoming more secure. It's becoming less secure in many areas of Afghanistan. And so the poppy yield, the poppy crop is larger than it has been in years. And terrorist organizations are benefiting more and more from the profits of that crop. Another factor of why there's been more interdictions is that a lot of that crop is almost all of it's headed for Europe, and some of it heads overland and goes through, would have gone through places like Iraq and Syria and Turkey, but it's more and more difficult to smuggle things overland for obvious reasons like the civil war in Syria, the events in Iraq, and the tightening of the border in Turkey. And so instead of going overland, the other way it's going to come out, the drug trade is kind of like a balloon. If you squeeze the balloon, it tends to expand where it can somewhere else. And so the drug trade that couldn't go over has gone down through Pakistan and Iran to the coast and out through the coast to sea. And then the last reason there's more of an increase, more interdictions, is we're getting better at finding it. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game between the smugglers and the people who are working against smugglers, police forces, and militaries in that region, and coast guards. We were getting better at finding it and understanding their modus operandi. But it's a learning game on both sides, and they learn as well. And so while we had massive success in 2014, we didn't have as much success in 2015. This map is intended just to show you where it's actually happening. So this is Afghanistan. That's where the drugs all originate out of. As I said, a lot of it travels over land, but it's harder and harder to get it over land. And so lots of it is smuggled down here through Pakistan and through Iran to this place here called the Makran Coast, where it gets transported into dhows. And so these are all dhows. These are all successful drug busts in 2014. Those dhows, there's hundreds of them off the coast on any given day. And those dhows are there for legitimate reasons. They're what do all the coastal transfers, cargo transfers. They're also the fishing dhows. So there's hundreds of them out there, and they're all there for legitimate reasons, except a few. And those few are very hard to pick out of them, the mass. Unless you know for sure that a ship has drugs on it, there's no way to figure out which one it is when it's off the Makran Coast. We say it's like picking out fly shit out of pepper, is the phrase we use. It's very hard to find. But they don't stay there. The reason they transfer down here to the east coast of Africa is because these countries don't have large navies or large coast guards. They don't have very large police forces in most cases. It's possible to get it in there and then smuggle it out of there in various ways. Get into a container ship, get it down to South Africa where there's lots of lines of communication with Europe, get it on board planes, get it into human mules who smuggle it on their bodies, and get it up to Europe where it's sold and used. And so when one of these vessels travels down to the east coast of Africa and shows up there, it's pretty obvious that nobody traveled 1,000 miles in a wooden dhow for fish, because there's fish here. So when you see one there, it's almost always doing something wrong, doing something illegal, and in this case, smuggling drugs. And so, as you can see, all of those busts in 2014 happened here. And so the key to the success of those busts is intelligence. You have to know they're leaving. And so there's various ways that we get that intelligence. And then it's about surveillance. It's really helpful to have a surveillance aircraft that you can use at the time. And then it's helpful to have ships here who can interdict it, because it's still a challenge. You're still trying to find the ship in a big ocean. And it is difficult to find a little wooden ship in a big ocean before they get in and unload it. And so that's the key to the success of that mission. But before I left, my boss was really clear to me. If it was just drugs, we wouldn't be going. So it's, the Canadian Armed Forces are not sending people over to the Indian Ocean in a counter-drug mission. It's a counter-terrorism mission. If there was no link between the drugs and the terrorism, we wouldn't go. It's absolutely about terrorism. So all of you remember and understand this. This was a real turning point for navies in the world in the fight against terrorism. Up to then, we really didn't think about terrorism very much. It was kind of a sideline business. But the attack against the coal in 2000 alongside Yemen in Aden, they were getting some fuel in Aden, Yemen, and while they were there, a small skiff came alongside. The crew believed that they were there to get their gash, their garbage, but they weren't. As the skiff with two Yemeni members of Al-Qaeda on board came alongside the USS Cole, detonated that small boat, killed 17 US sailors. Unbelievable acts of heroism that kept that ship from sinking right where it was, and from much greater numbers of fatalities. Unbelievable acts of heroism. And the US Navy, if you're tracking this, you'll know the US Navy did whatever it took to keep that ship floating and then repaired it. They probably could have bought a ship cheaper than what it cost to repair that ship, but they were determined to show that they weren't going to be stopped by terrorism. And so USS Cole still sailing around the world doing all sorts of missions, including the counterterrorism mission. And then we don't really need to describe what happened here, but it's important to remember that this is obviously a key moment in the struggle against terrorism. This is the moment where people all decide that something's got to be done larger than the small efforts up to that point. And so after 9/11, as we all recall, the United States enacted Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. And Article 5 says that an attack against one is an attack against all. It's the only time it's ever been enacted. All members of NATO were obligated by the treaty to do what they could in this struggle against terrorism based on the United States identifying Al-Qaeda as having attacked them. And so off we went on Operation Apollo, which is the Canadian Armed Forces operation against terrorism after the events of 9/11. What a lot of people don't remember is that the first units to get there were Navy units. And there's a cultural and logistical difference between Navy units and Army and Air Force units. If you want to get and it's no slight, it's just the truth of it, if you want to get the Army to get somewhere, you line up every single vehicle, and you line up every single soldier, and you line up all their meals, and all their ammunition, and all their gas, and you get it all organized, and you make a plan, and when you've got it all together, then you move. And it's the same with the Air Force. They have to have a runway. They have to have a base. It's got to be all set, or they're just not going to be any good when they get there. It takes some effort. The Navy is completely different. And so in the Navy, if the Army is plan, then move, the Navy is move, then plan. So the Navy just gets going, and they make a plan on their way. We didn't know why we were going, but we went. So the first ship on that list of 17 that went in the 2 years after 9/11 was HMCS Halifax. She was alongside in Rota, Spain. They got a call to the commanding officer that day. He got his crew back on board, and they left Rota, Spain, chopped out of NATO, and headed for the Middle East, not sure exactly what they were going to do. 3 more ships began training on the East Coast and were out of there in less than 2 weeks. A ship on the West Coast began training and was out of there a few weeks later, and there were 5 ships from the Canadian Navy there inside a month, conducting counterterrorism missions. The first thing they did was the protection of the amphibious readiness group. And so we knew that a direct attack by terrorists against the amphibious readiness group was possible, because that was the group that was launching airstrikes into Afghanistan first, because again, navies can get there faster than armies and air forces. And so they were conducting strikes into Afghanistan, and they were dropping special forces in to help the Northern Alliance. And so they're the spearhead of that attack, and the Canadian Navy was involved in protecting those ships from a possible direct terrorist attack. After we'd finished that work, there was a lot of thought that as we squeezed the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, that they would begin to try to escape. And we thought that they might try to escape by sea. We know now that most of the senior people didn't go nearly as far as we thought they were going to. They went to Pakistan and then holed up in Pakistan. But some of the middle-ranking and junior-ranking people did slip out through Pakistan and Iran and tried to get to sea. And every ship that left the coast there was stopped and inspected to see whether there was anybody on board who had any link at all to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And one of the byproducts of doing that work was we began to understand what was going on in that region and how it was related to terrorism. And so that's where we discovered the push of drugs that we're moving through, and the push of other kind of smuggling, and how that smuggling is related to terrorism through ownership of the poppy fields in some case and the means of production, and in some cases just through the taxation of those fields, and in some cases through the taxation of the transportation of it. And in all cases, a large amount of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda's funding was coming from the drug trade, and it was going up as the years went on. So there's a larger context, though. As I said, it was never about drugs, and it's not just about terrorism either. It's about a larger context. And so this diagram, and I'm not a poli-sci major, and there are people in here who are poli-sci profs who could better explain it to you. But my understanding of this model, this ends, ways, and means model, is that practitioners like me go at it and say, well, if the end is what you want here, government, and this is the way you want us to do it, well, the means don't equal the ends, so this delta between the level and here is the difference that you owe me. Buy me that many more ships, buy me that much more equipment, and then I'll deliver the ends that you've asked me for. And that's the way the model gets used really simply. My purpose of the model, a little bit different today. What I'm working to argue here today is that we actually, the ends of this mission are larger than just counterterrorism, and they involve the stability of the region. It's an important region where 17 million barrels of oil a day pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And even if Canadians weren't using that oil, if the world economy had to deal with even just a slowdown of that oil, let alone an actual stopping of that oil because of a terrorist threat or any other stability issue, the world economy would come off the rails. And we all, including us here in Canada, would suffer. And so it's in all of our interest to have a stable region. As well, a stable region where governance is good and where corruption is kept under a low enough level is a region where there's less chance of terrorism breaking out into that vacuum. And so the work that's done there is not just straight counterterrorism, but it's an overall stability mission. That's a big mission. And if you're talking about the Canadian Navy, there's only so many ships the Canadian Navy can send out at any given time. If that's one of the tools that we're using, how do we, with that limited means, achieve that end? And the way we do that is here, the way is about multilateralism. It's about partnerships, it's about coalitions, and so Combined Task Force 150 is a way that the Canadian Navy contributes to that larger end of stability over and above just the straight counterterrorism mission. And we weren't the only people who thought that way. So after 9/11, not just NATO ships flowed into theater trying to get something done. Ships from all around the world flowed into theater because countries all around the world have a large stake in the stability of that region. And not just that region, lots of regions, but this region's a particularly important region. And so those 30 nations over the last 15 years have joined Combined Maritime Forces, and it formed up informally right after 9/11. There was a loose coalition of the willing in that area, and then it became more formalized over the years into what's called Combined Maritime Forces, that it now includes 30 partner nations. And it's a unique partnership. It's different than anything else. So if you're in NATO, there are 28 nations now in NATO. All 28 have to agree on any course of action before NATO will take that course of action. If one of the 28 says that's not a policy that we'll accept, then we don't do it. CMF's completely different. There's no treaty. Every one of the 30 partnership nations that contribute to that come with what they're willing to do in terms of a mandate and what their rules of engagement are, and then the partnership works with them to put their assets in a position to succeed inside the mandate they're willing to conduct. So a very unique and very successful partnership. No one's ever quit CMF. Countries just keep coming to it because it allows them to achieve their national goals inside a broader context of regional stability, counterterrorism, and counter-piracy. So the whole world, in the United States' mind, is divided into theaters of operation, and they have a COCOM, a combined commander for each of those regions. And the region we all hear about the most in the news, because it's the region where the most turmoil is, it appears to me, and the region where there's the most important question about stability is this region, the Middle East. And so in Tampa is a 4-star U.S. general who controls all U.S. military action in support of their goals in that region. And below him is his maritime component commander, the commander of the 5th Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain. As ships flowed in, and the commander of the day was trying to sort out how to organize those ships of partnership nations, they fell upon the idea to invent combined maritime forces and double hat this person. So Admiral Miller, when I was there, was Commander 5th Fleet, and he was also the commander of combined maritime forces. And that's how he worked on a formal structure that let his forces work with partner forces. He's a pretty busy fella, and his staff's pretty busy, and so they don't have time to the day-to-day looking at combined maritime forces. They really trust the partner nations to jump on that. And so underneath him is a deputy commander. It's a UK Commodore who is there for a 2-year posting. And then we have 3 task forces under combined maritime forces, which change out on a rotational basis. And so we were there. The Canadians were commanding Combined Task Force 150. That's the Counter-Terrorism mission. The Saudi Arabians, real success story, were commanding Task Force 152, and that's inside the Arabian Gulf itself, and it's all about regional cooperation with regional partners. And then 151 is the Counter-Piracy mission that was being commanded by the Thai Navy, and after the Thai Navy, the Pakistani Navy, while I was there, and they're very focused on that Counter-Piracy mission. This is what the theater looks like. It's a really vast amount of space for what is usually a pretty small number of ships available. Because given what's happening in Iraq and Syria, most of the American ships are right up here, busy with an Iraq and Syrian mission. And they're also always concerned with keeping the peace with Iran. So they're up here again, looking north towards Iran to make sure that there's no issues there, no conflict that might threaten the stability of the region. And then the rest of it is left up to everybody else in the world to make sure there's no stability issues. So 152 is those smaller countries that are around that region contribute ships to that, and they work together to patrol that area and to begin to learn how to cooperate with each other and with allies from outside the region. 151 is very focused on that counter-piracy mission, so they're really just tight around Somalia, which was the source of the piracy question, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then the whole rest of the region is the theater of operations for 150. So typically, there was anywhere between 2 and 6 ships a day under our command to look after what is 2.4 million square nautical miles, or 5 million square kilometers. So really an intelligence-driven mission. Anything that could be accomplished there was accomplished because we knew something was happening in a certain area, and the assets we did have, we concentrated in that area at that given time. No way to just, there's no amount of ships in the world that could just patrol it and make sure that it was secure and safe and free of crime or terrorism all the time. It's about intelligence and being in the right place at the right time. Counter-piracy. So we'll talk about counter-piracy. That's the 151 mission. But in international law, every navy in the world, if they are in a position to detect an act of piracy, or if they receive a distress call about an act of piracy, they are obligated by international law to take action to stop the pirates. And so even if you're not on a counter-piracy mission, which we were not, the ships that are under your command are, and they have to be ready about that counter-piracy mission. So we had a good look at how's the counter-piracy mission going. This is a given day of where the ships were while I was there last year. In orange then are the ships under our command, Task Force 150. There was a British and 2 American ships operating for us doing a counter-narcotics, counter-smuggling operation off the Coast coast. There was a Saudi ship under our command in the Red Sea doing a counter-smuggling operation. And like I said, every ship that's there is always ready to act in a case of piracy, but they weren't in the prime areas of piracy, and we didn't expect them to come across it. Down doing the counter-piracy mission specifically, these gray ones are the 151 ships. At the time, they were under the command of a Thai officer in Bahrain. There was 3, a Turkish ship, Japanese ship, and a Korean ship. In addition to those 3 doing that counter-piracy mission, there were 4 ships from the EU. So the EU has an operation, Atalanta, that's ongoing and has been renewed for another year, a counter-piracy mission. And so they have between 4 and 6 ships any given day off of Somalia doing a counter-piracy mission. And it's an interesting mission. They're focused not just on patrolling, but also on beginning capacity building with the governments ashore and the authorities ashore in Somalia. And so they're doing some great work. In addition to that, NATO has a mission And so NATO's mission is called Operation Ocean Shield. It's pretty much on hiatus because NATO ships are busy in and around Europe doing reassurance measures based on the Russian activity in the Ukraine, and as well reassurance measures in the Baltic up north, and as well they're worried about migrants coming across the Mediterranean. So NATO ships are there. You'll note that the one NATO ship here, this is an Australian flag. And I know we all know Australia is not part of NATO. So why was she there? It just goes to show the flexibility of warships. So Australia had their tanker, the Success, in theater. She regularly worked for us in 150 and was a great asset, and we used her in all sorts of innovative ways because Australians are keen and they can do more than just be a tanker. They were a great patrolling ship, a great vessel for finding smugglers. But on this particular day, she chopped into NATO just because they were working their interoperability piece. So she was reporting up through NATO and doing the counter-piracy mission for a few days. And then this blue one here, 6th Fleet. So that's an American ship. If this whole area is the 5th Fleet area, Africa is the 6th Fleet area, and so 6th Fleet has a ship under its command all the time doing direct action in Somalia if required, so close to the shore in Somalia. And then what's really interesting are these two flags. There's a lot of independent deployers who are not part of combined maritime forces, but are interested in the counter-piracy mission and are determined to do something about it. So in this case, that's China, who had anywhere between 1 and 3 ships on any given day doing a counter-piracy mission, and Russia, who always had a ship there. And what was really interesting about that was how well, on this file, they work with all the Western countries and all the countries of CMF. So we have a shared awareness and deconfliction conference 3 times a year in Bahrain that's attended by senior personnel from China and Russia who are determined to work with us in that area so that the ships that are available, including their ships, are not all on top of each other, and that they're doing a good job of covering the space that's needed to be covered with ships. So what's important about this graph isn't the numbers again, it's really the sort of look at the charts. Where there's solid colors, that's attacks, both successful and thwarted. So that's 2011. And where there's no solid color in there, those are false alarms. And so what you can see, the takeaway from this is that there hasn't been a successful attack in 2 years. And why? And so how has it been that we've suppressed piracy to the point that no successful attack in 2 years? Several reasons. The first of that is, as you see, there's a bunch of warships off there all the time patrolling. At the height in 2010, 2011, there were double the number of ships that you saw on that slide doing that mission. The second reason is that the merchant ships who transit through that high-risk area have come to an agreement, a voluntary agreement, to take certain measures for insurance purposes, really. And so they've agreed to carry an armed team on board. They've agreed to not transit too close to the coast. They've agreed to monitor a certain radio frequency so that they can call for distress. There's a center set up in Dubai that relays that call and makes sure that the closest warship would come to their aid. So all those measures are a big part of it. And lastly, the situation is actually a little better in Somalia than it was at the height. And so the risk-reward calculation of a pirate has swung to more risk than reward. And so not been a successful pirate attack in 2 years. A great news story. My sense is that piracy could return because those pirates weren't all locked up in prisons. In some cases, they were because most of the countries involved in the counter-piracy mission have an agreement with the Seychelles, and so they can be prosecuted in the Seychelles, and then they either stay in the Seychelles or they get transferred back to the country of origin, in all cases Somalia, and finish their prison sentence in Somalia. But lots of the pirates who weren't captured and are still living in Somalia, doing other things, especially the people with money who weren't the actual pirates, but the kingpins of it. They're still there, and so if the risk-reward balance were to change back in the reward side, piracy could rear its head again. And so those organizations are still on it, always deciding how much effort to put into that counter-piracy mission. So we were there for the counter-terrorism mission as opposed to the counter-piracy mission, even though we were ready for the other one. And we did what we call an intelligence preparation of the battlefield. We tried to understand what was going on. And it was very complex. The terrorist organizations and relationships are really complex in this area. In some cases, they're allied. In some cases, they're rivals. In some cases, they just put up with each other. It's a complex area. So this is how we understood the area that we were going towards. We understood that there are criminal organizations that are moving narcotics once it gets to the east coast of Africa, to countries like Tanzania and Kenya. We understood that up here in Somalia, Al-Shabaab still controls a vast amount of the land, even though the African Union force has pushed them out of Mogadishu and out of the major cities along the coast. They're still outside those cities in the country and still control a lot of the land there. We understood that there's a lot of militia organizations that are involved in the smuggling of people and arms across the Gulf of Aden and across the Red Sea. There's a group of terrorists allied to ISIL in the Sinai Peninsula. They're the group that you've read about that are responsible for the bombing of the Russian commercial aircraft a few weeks ago. They also were involved in an attack against 2 Egyptian warships at sea while we were in theater. So they're an important part of it. ISIL, of course, we're all reading about ISIL all the time in Syria and Iraq. Down here in Yemen, there's an ongoing civil war. The Al-Houthi are the Shia rebels who overthrew the government for a while of Yemen, pushed that government out of Sana'a. They're still out of Sana'a. The government now back in Aden, but the civil war continues between the Al-Houthis and the Sunni-controlled government of Yemen. And that civil war has allowed greater space for the terrorists who are there. So Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that's the group that was originally responsible for the attack on the coal, has greater freedom of maneuver than it has in a long time. And there are groups who have broken away from that and declared themselves allied to ISIL in that area still. So we were well aware of that. And then, of course, up here in Afghanistan and Pakistan are the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They're the ones that are involved with the drug trade that we spoke about earlier, as well Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which is working out of India and Pakistan, attempted a major attack last year against just over a year ago now, in November, against the Pakistani warship in its home harbor of Karachi. So they attempted to take over the ship. It was an inside job, and there were people on the inside the Navy who were involved. They tried to take over the ship with the ultimate plan of getting that ship to sea and attacking a Western warship, conducting a counter-terrorism patrol at sea. They were foiled, but it was a close call. The other thing on this chart was trying to understand the smuggling. So as we talked about before, the drugs that come off the coast come off here in the Makran coast, and then they're transported down, in the case of heroin, to east coast of Africa, because that's a place where you can get it to Europe. And in the case of hash, it comes down here into Yemen. Again, a fairly lawless area where there's a lot of gaps in security, and a lot of that hash ends up in the Arabian Gulf in places like Dubai, in Saudi Arabia, and then some of it goes on up into Europe. And then the other one that was an interesting piece was, which we discovered I knew nothing about, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, was the smuggling of charcoal out of Somalia into destinations in the Middle East. And that smuggling of charcoal is illegal. So here's what I promised. I won't take you through this whole thing. We made a plan, of course. When you get a complex problem, you try to make a plan. The plan, so what's material for us is the plan included 4 lines of operation. So the one that most people think about is what we call maritime security operations. That's the direct action at sea, patrolling at sea, interdictions at sea. But that was only one part of our plan, and we recognized that we're only going to be so many ships. And so the challenge to the team was, think of the ways that we can have an important impact in the short time we're there, that even if there was never a ship under our command, could we get something done? And yes, of course, you can get things done, and the way you can get things done are the other lines of operation. Regional cooperation, which we'll talk about, is a real key. Sharing information with your partners, enabling your partners who are there all the time to have success against terrorism and against smuggling was a key. Capacity building, in some cases, some of these countries don't have large navies, don't have large security forces, and it was a key to be able to work on their capacity with them. And then information operations, that's everything from getting the word out to Canadians so they know that the work we're doing is important, getting the word out to regional partners so that they trust us and will share their intelligence with us the way we share with them, and getting the word out to smugglers so that they know that the risk-reward balance is wrong and that we're on the job and that they should look for another line of work. So all sorts of ways to use information. And those 4 lines are all tied together. When you have success in one, you try to leverage it against success in the other. So a really successful piece would have been, if we could do a successful drug bust during an exercise that was building capacity with a regional partner and get the word out, that's a home run, right? We use this slide a lot to describe to people how we knew that terrorism and drugs in particular are linked. And so that's the poppy field in Afghanistan. We have solid intelligence that shows how those poppy fields contribute to terrorism through taxation, through extortion, through the taxing of transportation, and then we know through tracing all sorts of bits of intelligence, human intelligence, communications intelligence, that they're going out in dhows. We've stopped these dhows and found that stuff and traced that crop back to certain areas of Afghanistan. And we understand how it is through police forces, and there's a regional narcotics information fusion center in Bahrain where the police forces of some of the partners work together to share their information with the militaries who work there. And so the links are really clear. The other thing that was really clear from this analysis was that this was the only place that a maritime force was going to have any difference, right? I'm not going to send my sailors to Afghanistan, and I'm not sending my sailors to the streets of Europe. So if we were going to make a difference, it was here. Charcoal. Charcoal was a really interesting, and I always say, I was surprised to hear about charcoal. I'm pro-charcoal. I like a barbecue as much as everybody. Thanks for laughing. I always get a small laugh out of that. Yeah. But it turns out that charcoal is an important contributor to the funding of al-Shabaab. So important. So the Somalia Eritrea Monitoring Group of the United Nations, they're the experts on this. We worked really closely with them because no one had been doing anything about charcoal. When I showed up in Bahrain, we learned a little bit about charcoal, and I went to see my boss, Admiral Miller, and I said, I understand charcoal's a problem, sir. What do you want us to do about it? And he was really straightforward with me. He said, Brian, we're pretty busy. We've got this Iraq-Syria thing. We're watching Iran. Straight to Hormuz. We're busy. You do something. And come up with a plan. Let me know what it is. So we challenged the staff. We pulled them aside and we said, look, nobody's doing anything about this charcoal smuggling. We know it's a problem, that it contributes 40 to 70% of al-Shabaab's funding, because the Eritrea Somalia Monitoring Group has told us that. Become the experts. Become the world's best experts in this problem and come up with some solutions. And so they did that. They were a really sharp group. And it was important. This top left is the attack against the Westgate Mall, all funded with al-Shabaab funding. So with 40 to 70% of that came from the smuggling of charcoal. Charcoal, in this case, is it's made from the trees in Somalia, the acacia trees. And they're gnarly old trees, and they take a long time to grow because it's dry. And because they take so long to grow, the grain's really tight, and they burn really slow, and they make the world's best charcoal, apparently, and it's prized. And if you've ever been to the Middle East, they have all these shops, these shisha smoke shops, and there's little water pipes with 3 or 4 tubes coming out where the tobacco smoke comes through, and the way it burns is you put charcoal in the top. And the charcoal burns for a long time. It's cheap because it's coming from a poor country, and it's good charcoal, and they want it. And most people don't even know that the charcoal is illegal. They have no idea where it's coming from. But they cut these trees down. It's an environmental disaster right off the start. It's a problem for Somalia because there's no government there that's strong enough to actually control and collect a royalty for that, and there's nobody to protect the environment. So that's a problem for sure. And then on top of it, al-Shabaab controls the lands in many cases where the charcoal is made, and more importantly, it controls the roads between there and the coast where it gets smuggled out of. And so what happens is a truck full of charcoal that's made in these fields drives towards the coast, and they get stopped by an armed gang of al-Shabaab terrorists, and they pay a tax, and they actually get a receipt. We've actually seen the receipts that these truck drivers get, because there's because you could drive around it, right? Pick a different road maybe. And so there's a whole series of these checkpoints, and these terrorists seem like they're pretty honorable when it comes to taxation, at least, because apparently if you show your receipt to the next checkpoint, you don't have to pay twice. So they got that going for them. Anyway, so they go down to the coast of Somalia, and they load them up in huge piles which was our first indication we might be able to do something about it, even if we didn't have a ton of ships available on any given day, because you can see these from the air. Huge piles on the beaches of Somalia where they're going to embark them in boats. Because in Somalia, there's only a couple ports with actual jetty facilities, so you can't put this stuff on a container ship. You can only put it on smaller ships. So the ships that transport it are these dhows again, and most of them are coming from India. We've discovered, and the people running these dhows, they don't even know it's illegal. They don't know, because right now it's illegal only because there's a United Nations Security Council resolution, because the Eritrea Somalia Monitoring Group pointed out the problem. The British sponsored a Security Council resolution 2182, and the Security Council actually made it illegal to transport charcoal and called upon all nations of the world to do what they can to stop it. But Indians driving these dhows, they don't know it's illegal. So anyway, they have a good trade route. They leave India, they go across to Somalia, they pick up a load of charcoal on the cheap, they run that charcoal up to some place in the Middle East, places like Dubai or Bahrain or Qatar. They unload that and pick up some other item, something like iPads or whatever, and they run that back to India and sell those, and then they keep going. They quick triangle route, and it's a good trade for them, and they don't know that it's illegal in most cases. Although the holding companies that own these dhows, they know now. They know that it's illegal, but they keep doing it because no one stopped them to date. So we looked at what can we do to stop them. If you can't actually do the interdiction yourself, how can you do it? Well, you start to cobble together all the things you know about each time. So in this case, we knew there was a pile of it there from aerial photography and from human intelligence sources. We knew from just tracking all the ships that you can track any given day that there was a dhow coming from India and was going to be off the coast. We knew basically the day she left. And then every time we got a chance, everybody who was in that area not working for us, we made sure they knew we were looking for this ship. And then we got several reports as they went north from Allied ships who weren't working in CTF 150 but knew what we were trying to get done. And eventually we figured out where she was going. She was going to Dubai. This is a Dubai customs official. So the day before the ship showed up, we made sure that the UN officer responsible was on the jetty to monitor it. And we made sure that the customs official was ready, and then they did the interdiction. And this is the crew of the ship. They don't know that they're in trouble. They know something's wrong, but they don't really know exactly what's wrong when this photo's taken. But they seized all that charcoal. And so this is a good example of the sort of policy challenge and innovative thinking that has to be done to stop this when you have a limited number of resources. You have to work as a team, and a multilateral team. You have to figure out ways to work together to stop it. And so every time you stop that, you don't immediately stop Al-Shabaab from getting money, but this group paid for the charcoal in Somalia, and now they're not getting the money for the charcoal in Dubai. So maybe they don't do it next time. Maybe they do something else, because those are months. And if you've ever been on one of these things, you don't want to go on these for nothing. You know, if you're not making the money, you're not going to do it twice. It's not that nice. So the idea is that we squeeze off their ability to make money, squeeze them out of the trade, and then eventually there's no way to get the charcoal out of Somalia. Talk about regional cooperation. That was such an important part of it, because as we said, there's only so many Western ships that are going to be able to do this mission. There's lots of other missions in the world to do. How do you make a lasting impact? You make a lasting impact by convincing the people who live there every day that there's a problem, and that you're going to work with them in your small way, and it's worth them working with you in order to cut off the funding to terrorism and to be ready in the event of a direct attack of terrorists. So this picture here is in Pakistan. That's Nick Stoker. He was my Australian deputy commander. Great fellow. We sent him over to Pakistan to talk with the Pakistani forces. They're very gripped with this counter-drug problem and the nexus between drugs and terrorism. They have ongoing attacks in Pakistan all the time. When I was there, they wouldn't let me go anywhere without being in an armored vehicle. They're very concerned about terrorism, and they're working hard at it, and they're working hard against the counter-drug piece. But they don't always work that well with each other, let alone with us, in terms of sharing information. So it was about getting over there and working with them to share information when they knew drugs were leaving their coast. If they hadn't been able to interdict it, that's one more bit of information we could have to try to put others in position to succeed. At the other end of the track then, Kenya, that's the deputy commander of the Kenyan Navy. They're a keen, young Navy, but they don't have unlimited resources. And so they could use some help in terms of succeeding at the other end of the track. And one of the interesting things about drugs is that, and I guess I knew this because I know about the law of the sea being a naval officer, but I didn't think about it. So it's illegal to have heroin in Canada. It's illegal to have heroin in Pakistan. It's illegal to have heroin in Kenya, but it's not illegal to have heroin at sea in your ship. You can, once you're out at sea, you can drive around anywhere you like. You're not breaking anybody's law. As long as you don't go in anywhere, you're good. So when an international warship discovers a vessel full of heroin, we just dump it over the side. And what's the legal basis for doing that? We don't have one. But who's going to complain, right? They're going to complain to their drug lords? I mean, there's nothing they can really do about it. So we don't worry about whether they're unhappy with it. And in so doing, we take those drugs out of the market and we make it harder for them to make a profit. And hopefully we impact Al Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But if we could arrest them in the waters they're going to or coming from, then those people would end up in a prison. So in the case of Kenya, we've had some success in the last couple of years, knowing that a ship was coming, helping the Kenyans be ready for that event, working with them in every step of the way through intelligence, through the arrest, through the seizure of the drugs, through the holding and protection of the evidence, through the court case, and through the prison work, helping them at every level in terms of capacity building. We've had a much larger impact on the drug trade and on terrorism by taking those smugglers and that boat out of the enemy order of battle. We also traveled to Jordan. Jordan's an important spot. Jordan is it's a very small navy, 500 sailors total, and with 3 small ships that do patrols of their own coast. But they're important to the overall counterterrorism effort because of where they are. They're right next to the Sinai Peninsula, which, as I said, is an ongoing terrorist threat there. And if that terrorist threat got to the point where it could close the Suez Canal, the world economy would suffer. So their knowledge of the area and their proximity and readiness to act and their ability to work with us is really key. So we were up there to work with them to make sure we were ready in the event of a direct terrorist attack near or in the Suez Canal so that we could be working with them and they could help us keep the southern part of it open with their forces. South Africa is an important one. South Africa is not a member of CMF. We would really like to see them as a member of Combined Maritime Forces. That's the most professional, best equipped Navy in Africa. And they regularly do patrols up the east coast of Africa. They were involved in the Counter-Piracy piece. And there's a lot of room for them to work with partners in Africa to help them in the way that we want to help partners in Africa be ready about the smuggling of drugs. And we were able to talk to them because we know through our police forces, international police forces, that drugs are going from Kenya and Tanzania and being smuggled into South Africa and then out of South Africa. So it's a challenge for them locally over and above the links to terrorism. And so we're working with them to convince them to be involved with us. Slow process, but an important one. And then the last one we were in was Saudi Arabia, really a key partner in the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf. Working with Saudi Arabia is a challenge. They're a unique place. They're the most hospitable people that I got to visit. They're the kindest hosts. But there's always a certain sense of distrust there with whether we're sharing the information that we have fully with them and whether they're willing to share it back. And so it's always important to go and face to face. They have this feeling there that the Americans are kind of hanging onto this information and they're not sharing it properly. But as I told them, inside Combined Maritime Forces, that's 30 nations. Of the 30 nations, 25 believe what's called Five Eyes, who share information very regularly with each other. That's the United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. That 5 of us aren't sharing all the information. And inside those 5, though, there are 4 who really think one has all the information. And so there's this sense of, you have to break through this sense that nobody's really hiding anything. So my sense of it, as I told them, was in the Red Sea, it's not that the 1 is hiding from the 5 is hiding from the 30, it's that none of us really know what's happening. And if you're going to smuggle something from Port Sudan in Sudan across to Saudi Arabia, it only takes a couple hours in a fast boat. So unless you know it's leaving, you're never going to have forces in a position to interdict it. It's going to get there, and you're not going to do anything about it. And so, it's not that Western forces know what's going on everywhere in the world and can tell them. It's that they've got a better chance of knowing than anybody else because they live there and they speak the language and they're regular patrolling, and we want to know what they know, and we're not hiding anything. And so that's those sort of face-to-face conversations where they can look you in the eye and have a cup of tea with you and actually believe you are really key to building cooperation in the region. Capacity building. So we did this exercise, and there's a little clip here in a second that will talk about it better than I can now, although it's just me talking, so if you're bored of me now, sorry, I'm in the clip too. But this exercise was really important. Some of these countries, as I said, don't have tons of resources to put into training, and so this is a great way to involve your forces in the training in this particular exercise off the east coast of Africa. So we sent part of our staff of 31, we sent out to 3 different operation centers, and we brought 2 extra people in from Canada for the exercise. Those 2 in the top left, those gentlemen there, are Naval Boarding Party instructors, and Canada has a great reputation in the world for being among the best in those naval boarding party operations, those interdiction at sea of another vessel, the search, the seizure, all that work. And so we sent them over, and they trained 7 different teams. And I am firmly convinced that of all things we do in the counterterrorism field, the most important and enduring ones have to do with good governance and corruption. Where there's poor governance and high levels of corruption, there's a vacuum, and that's where terrorism comes. And every small toolkit you have, a tool in the toolkit you have, has got to be focused on collective efforts to improve governance and reduce corruption, and that includes every kind of security force you can imagine. So getting over and working and building capacity with these organizations, just one little bit of that kind of capacity building that makes a difference in the long run. Alrighty, so this is the clip. Well, Combined Maritime Forces is a collection of 30 nations that came together after the events of 9/11 here in this area of the world, in the Western Indian Ocean. And they came together in order to protect the maritime traffic from the threat of terrorism. And so Combined Task Force 150 is one of 3 task forces that are part of Combined Maritime Forces. Task Force 150 has the mandate for counterterrorism operations here in the Western Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aden. And the way we do that in this area is we do maritime security operations. And what maritime security operations involve are getting ships and aircraft to sea in order to monitor the area, in order to react to any activities that happen, and in order to make sure that the area is safe for legitimate use of the oceans. Cutlass Express offered us the most important opportunity during our short rotation here to increase the capacity of our regional partners. And I think that that's going to pay dividends for years to come in our ability to work together with regional partners and in our confidence in each other that we can do this job effectively. So Cutlass Express is the exercise here on the east coast of Africa, and it was really useful to us to be involved in this exercise to increase our capacity to work with the operations center. So we sent out teams to 3 different maritime operations centers: Kenya, Tanzania, and Mauritius. And while they were there, they worked daily with those teams to increase our ability to operate with them on a daily basis, not just in exercises. Additionally, we worked with the boarding parties of 7 different nations. So we sent 2 Royal Canadian Navy boarding party instructors who worked with the US Navy SEALs and the US Coast Guard teams to deliver training to 7 different regional partner boarding teams. They did a great job of increasing our ability to work with them, to build our confidence in each other and in each other's procedures, such that if we need to do this for real, we'll know that we can trust each other to do a great job. So coming down here and being involved in Cutlass Express contributes directly to the prosperity and the security of Canadians wherever they're operating, whether that's at home or abroad. Our team is an integrated Canadian and Australian team, and it's quite unique. In most cases, when countries come and take their turn of commanding one of the task forces, they come with just their own country staff. But our Admiral and the Admiral of the Royal Australian Navy saw a real opportunity to learn from each other. Australia and Canada have traditionally been 2 of the heavier lifters here in CTF 150. They've had the lion's share of the successful interdictions, and both countries are recognized in CMF as real leaders. I think it's important that Canadians understand the great work that their people are doing here in Bahrain, the great leadership that they've taken on, and the effectiveness that they've provided to Combined Maritime Forces and to our regional partners in combating terrorism and terrorist-related activity. Canadians should be very proud of that effort and of that ability. We're well recognized around the world as being leaders in this field in managing and controlling and commanding naval forces of all nations, and in doing it in a way that makes every partner feel valued. and Canadians should definitely be proud of that. So that was the team that we took. As I said, there were 7 Australians in that team, including the deputy commander. It was a really multidisciplinary team. There were 2 civilian members of the team from the Department of National Defense. So that's Olivier, who was my policy advisor, key in being able to work with United Nations groups and with the European Union and with NATO, really able to speak the speak. The other thing that was the civilians brought, well, that's Matt. He's our operational analyst, and lots of countries go and they just kind of, they take their turn, and they enjoy being in command, and they move ships around, but they don't really think about advancing the issues. And you can't advance the issues if you don't understand them. And so a lot of the information that's collected gets left on the cutting room floor, as we said. So Matt did a great job of cleaning up the information, picking up the stuff on the cutting room floor, making it managed, and analyzing it, and then putting in place a system that can improve how that's collected over the long haul. A really great long-term story. And then the rest of the team included 5 intelligence operators led by Steve Morris here, who is our senior INTO. Most countries come and they don't bring any intelligence analysts. They just rely on the intelligence given to them by the host nation, by the United States. But we know that lots of the intelligence, lots of the understanding comes from unclassed sources. It doesn't always come from super secret 007 kind of folks. Usually, it starts with reading and understanding what's going on the ground. And then there are little bits of classified intelligence that come and fill in the picture. But the picture starts just by mental capacity of bright people. And so we brought 5 bright people ourselves to make sure that we were contributing to that, including a couple Army intelligence operators. And as well, there were 2 members of the Air Force on the team, really key to doing a good job of managing the air assets and getting extra air assets that we could control. A lot of the work in Bahrain, because it's a coalition of the willing, is about negotiation. So you spend an awful lot of time talking to people, convincing them to not only work with you, but work better with you. People ask, what did I get when I had to go in there? What I really got was an informal master's degree in coalition building. It's all about learning how to make people feel appreciated. And so the Canadians should be really proud of the work that was done there. The real success story, the thing that makes Canadians, and I think Australians, because they're so much like us, different than lots of other countries, is twofold. One, we're just instantly interoperable with Americans, and then they trust us. And they trusted us in giving us a ton of their assets for us to command and not for them to command, because they trust us to do something useful with them. And that was really important. And then the flip side of that coin is Canadians are a humble lot, really. They never speak down to all the other partner nations. And this staff in particular was very good. They weren't an A-team, they were just whoever the Navy had available on the day. But they did a really great job of folding other nations into the tent and making their contributions appreciated and making sure other nations understood that we were setting them up for success. So if any ship joined us and they couldn't get to Bahrain first, we went where they were and briefed them in, made sure that they understood what we were trying to get done. If they were with us for a week, and that was all we could get them for, it didn't matter. I'd send 2 or 3 members of the team to wherever they were coming into the theater and get them a good brief and make sure that they were ready to work with us. And countries really appreciate that. And it showed up in one of the most interesting things was, for lots of strategic reasons, Canada couldn't afford to send a ship while we were in command. So there was never a ship under our command that was Canadian. But lots of other countries were. And it's a real testament to them, that Americans and Australians, UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, they all lent us ships for varying periods of time in significant numbers because they trust this team to do a great job of looking after them and putting them in a position to succeed and making a difference in the long run, as opposed to just being there for a few months. All right, so that does it. We'll take some questions, I think.
The comfy chairs here. Perfect. So we're moving now to the fireside chat portion of the evening. Now, all joking aside, it's an opportunity for the audience, both here and online, to ask the Commodore some questions about what we've heard. So you'll see that there's audience mics on either side of the auditorium, so please feel free to come up and ask your questions. But while we're waiting for the audience, I suppose it gives me an opportunity to chat with you a little bit and ask a few questions. And before we get to that, I just wanted to thank you. I mean, the work that you guys were doing was so important over there, and we saw a number of the major successes, the drug interdictions, the counter-piracy operations, and I think the evidence was indicative of the number of seizures that went up. I mean, in 2014, that's a staggering jump. So I think that's a testament to your ability. So thank you very much for your work over there. I suppose my question is, in this theater, given the importance of the work, what was the biggest challenge that you faced while you were over there?
You know, the real challenge is that it's such a large area, and there's so few ships available, and often they're limited in where they can be employed. So, a country will tell you that they've got a ship that's available for 3 weeks. It's got to be in the Mediterranean 3 weeks from now, and so it can't linger for too long, and so it can't be just anywhere in that region. And so, even though it might be better at this moment, based on intelligence, to be near Kenya, you can't use them near Kenya. And so it was all about balancing what was available against what was needed, and setting people up for success.
And in that environment, I suppose that you would have had some that you saw that you wanted to stop, but that by definition had to slide by because you couldn't get an asset to the region quick enough.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And the other challenge is you don't have the legal right to get on board ships is a good challenge. So if a ship is a nationality, any nationality in the world, and it's clear where they're from, you don't really have a right to board those ships, even if you suspect that they might be carrying drugs. And so, working the legal challenge is really important. You need to create a reason for needing to board by verifying what state they're from. And so, working your way through that legal challenge and making sure that all the participating nations feel that you're not putting them in a bad legal position is a good challenge. We had a lawyer on the staff who was just great, and he daily had to think about how you do this legally and how you assure your allies that you're 100% above board.
Well, as a practicing lawyer, I'm sorry to hear that you had to talk to a lawyer every day. Actually, that's a good question. That brings up a good question. So during your talk, you'd indicated that there was an uncertain basis for jurisdiction in some instances. So what you'd do is you'd yank the drugs and toss them overboard, and it was kind of a law of the jungle. Now, let me ask you this: is there room? And it somewhat behooves us because we're sitting in an institution that focuses on global governance. Is there room for innovation here? Should we be looking for some sort of legal mechanism to provide that jurisdiction?
Yeah, I really think you're right. You're on the right thing, and it only took you 5 minutes. You must be a good lawyer. It took us a little while to think about it, and so we put our lawyer Ned Fox on it, because when we saw how we were working the charcoal question, we realized, well, there we have a legal mechanism through the UN. Through a Security Council resolution where we suspect that the vessel has charcoal for a valid reason. Why couldn't there be a similar resolution where we suspect drugs, particularly where we suspect that drugs have a nexus to terrorism? Wouldn't that be in the world's interests? And so one mechanism for sure could be a Security Council resolution, and Ned wrote a really good paper about why we should move in that way. But that's the kind of policy thing that Canadians, and I guess it shouldn't surprise us because we have this institute, so the Canadians think about these kind of questions, and Australians did too. We began the first initial pushes, I think, and hopefully when Canada and Australia are back here this year, we'll try to move that file along. But I think you're right. I think we need something like a Security Council resolution that enables participating nations to board where we suspect drugs and a nexus to terrorism.
It's incredible. So we've got a legal basis to stop the charcoal, and I like barbecuing as much as the next guy, but no legal basis to stop the heroin. So let's take a question from our online audience. The question is, are anti-terrorism joint efforts ever interpreted as provocative by other nations, i.e. in the Asia-Pacific, and how do you mitigate high tensions? And that's from Daniel in Ottawa. Thanks for the question, Daniel.
Yeah, that's a great question, and absolutely, even inside combined maritime forces, there are countries that won't do the counterterrorism mission or are interested in the counter-piracy mission. So Japan's a good point. The Japanese feel that the counterterrorism mission is too close to war and not in alignment with their current constitutional framework, and so they won't do that. They feel it's too provocative, the counterterrorism mission, but they are willing to contribute to the counter-piracy mission, and they lead there. They do a great job there. So absolutely, there are differences of opinions about what the right level of activity against terrorism and smuggling that might be related to terrorism.
That's good. We'll go to a question from our audience. If you could just introduce yourself at the microphone,
Certainly,
please.
thanks. My name's Morgan Fisher. I have an interest in intelligence and counterintelligence. I was interested to learn about the problem that took place in the Pakistani Navy with the issues there, and I was wondering how you approach that when you're having to share information with all these other navies, and one would have to assume that if the Navy, in that case, in Pakistan Navy, happened to be corrupt, that information is going to get to people that you don't want it to get to. How do you mitigate that?
Yeah, no, so every nation that produces intelligence has the right to decide how widely to share that. So if Canada gives information to a certain agency like the RNIFIC, the Regional Narcotics Intelligence Fusion Center, it's Canadian intelligence, then Canada has the right about whether it gets spread outside of that group after we give it to it. And if we want to, we call scrubbing it. So we might remove the source. We might want to share what we know without sharing how we know it. And so we scrub out of the report how we know something. In order to share it. If we're nervous with a certain partner, then we'll scrub out how we know something. And that usually lets us accomplish it. Sailors they just want to get the job done. And so in most cases, contributing countries are okay and understand in some cases that we will scrub out how we know something to give them what we know to enable their success.
We have an online question from Victoria in Toronto that dovetails nicely with that. So the question is, in terms of intelligence, are leaders of maritime terrorist groups distinct from non-maritime groups? Do they compete, and are they elusive to capture?
Yeah, my understanding, we don't, and maybe I misrepresented it in the speak, we don't really have maritime terrorist groups. There are terrorist groups who have taken action in the maritime domain, but fairly rarely, because as everybody who's ever tried to work with navies know, they're really expensive to build. And so even states that don't have tons of resources, they can't put an unlimited amount of resources to navies. And so no terrorist organization has a navy. In some cases, like with the coal, terrorist organizations have taken action in the maritime domain. And so no, they're not really distinct. The leaders aren't really distinct. They're the same group of leaders. And by and large, people don't go to sea unless they have to. It's like I like it, but most people don't go out other than cruise ships unless they have to.
No, it's a fair point. I guess it's unlikely that the leader of a terrorist organization is going to get on a skiff with the charcoal, him or herself. So I can appreciate that. Let me ask you this. So I think your remarks were very instructive tonight, and it showed, I think, me as a bit of an amateur in this area that there are a number of very, very capable navies involved, and a number of very, very capable state players. So it had me wondering, with all of these capable navies kind of working together, and in many instances having their naval operations closer to the theater, what the value add of Canada being there was, because I know that there is one, but I wanted to ask you this. So based on very capable navies, based on many of those navies being located closer to the theater, what is Canada's role and why was it valuable?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Would CMF survive without Canada? Yeah, it would survive without Canada, but there really is value added of that Canadian contribution, and I think it really comes back to the two-sided coin I spoke about right at the end about the ability to operate with the first world navies, the biggest and most capable navies of the world, and at the same time operate with and lead smaller regional navies and never condescend to them. And it's a uniquely Canadian, well, not absolutely uniquely, because I think like I said, I think Australia was very similar to us, but it's not very common that countries are both able to operate with first world navies and make the contributions of others feel respected. And so I think of all the things we do, and we really saw it right after 9/11 when Canadian task groups commanded large numbers of ships. Canada had a large contribution after 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, when the Canadian government said that we wouldn't be involved in that. Canada still had a very large contribution in the stability of the region by taking command of regional navies in order to secure the Straits of Hormuz and the area to the south and to the east of that. And that was an important contribution that could only be done by countries like Canada or Australia.
And actually, on the topic of the Canadian Navy, we've got a question from John in Waterloo online. And John's question is, what type of assets are at the disposal of the Canadian Navy in such anti-terrorism efforts? What types, I guess maybe there's a typo there, how can they be used?
Yeah, you know, what's really neat, this is what I would call a sea control mission. And the Canadian Navy, it really is a sea control Navy. It's about controlling a portion of the sea such that it can be used for your purposes and not for the enemy's. And so in that way, terrorists are a lot like any other potential enemy. You want to deny them the use of that area for the generation of funds. And so the kind of forces you need are vessels that can stay at sea for a longer duration. We found that the vessels that were successful in the counter-narcotic piece, they had to stay in the same area for a few weeks before they had any success. So you need a ship large enough that can stay at sea, so that when the smuggler comes, it can get there. You need to have good communication suites. So you really, because you need to be able to share intelligence. You need to be able to have either a drone or an organic helicopter. So you got to be large enough to be able to do that kind of search, because it's just hard to find these vessels. And ideally, you have both. So that's a fairly large ship. That's not a 300-ton ship. That's a 4,000, 5,000-ton ship, like a frigate. And the other asset that's really useful is maritime patrol aircraft. And so we had 2 maritime patrol aircraft that were Canadian, but were busy and still are in the missions over Iraq. And we couldn't use R2. But New Zealand had one, and it was by far the most useful asset in the area. Everybody wanted a piece of that New Zealand maritime patrol aircraft, because they can cover a vast amount of surface and get you both a wide sweep of what they see and some incredible imagery of specific things when they're tasked to do that. So they really are, that maritime patrol aircraft, probably the most useful asset potentially, and then surface ships.
We have a question from our audience.
Hi, my name is Tanuva. I work at the Manulife Financial in the money laundering department. I'm usually very curious and interested in counterterrorism. My question to you, I think it's going off of the last question that someone asked. The domestic issue of Canadian procurement in the Navy, how does that affect the efficiency and the operability of how we are doing all these counterterrorism missions, and how can we improve that, and whether the procurement challenges has an impact on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does in the long run, but the terrorism is a current operation challenge and a short-term future operations. And I don't know how long we'll do the counterterrorism mission specifically, although I think we'll do the stability kind of mission, which is very related and the same sort of thing. And it's the kind of things that navies have done for centuries, that sort of stability effort. And so we'll do that for a long, long time. The procurement questions are always, if you're not thinking about the ship that you need in 15 or 20 years, you're already too late. You've already dropped the ball. And so Canadians, the Canadian Navy is the history of the Canadian Navy is a boom and bust history where we drop the ball and pick the ball up and drop the ball and pick the ball up, and we could all blame admirals or politicians past for having dropped the ball and picked the ball up, but it's just the reality of living in a democracy where it's hard to make these difficult resource decisions. And so, long story short, it does affect it. It doesn't affect it in the short term. It affects our sustainable effort to do these kind of stability missions over the long haul. And as a country, we need, I think, it's an important tool in the toolbox. It's not the only tool. We need to get it right. We need to get the right kinds of ships that are capable for whatever the country wants them to do. And we don't know exactly what we want them to do, but we know we'll want something like this for a long time, and we got to get on with the next set of ships.
Thank you.
Really interested in your line of work, though, the money laundering question. So if you're sort of, do you see this nexus in the drugs and the terrorism piece and and money laundering? Is that, yeah?
So I worked with the Egmont intelligence group before, and I've seen the challenges that
Yeah, just step up to the microphone.
Yeah, everybody wants to hear what you have.
Yeah.
So I have a very interesting background because I've worked with the Egmont Financial Intelligence Group, which worked with financial intelligence unit across the world, and the challenges that they face specifically to do with how individual FIUs are doing in terms of, I guess, implementing the FATF and other UNODC standards. But the Navy thinks something that I was curious, and I don't know, I know Royal Military Navy does a lot of work, but you mentioned a lot about capacity building, and you mentioned a lot about multilateralism, and I know the challenges that comes with it, having worked at different organizations. So that's why I was wondering, and how our domestic political challenges will affect, impact these decisions. And I think you're right, we have to think about long-term solutions, because particularly talking about frigates and ships and capacity building and training, you need to think about how sustainable that is. And that's an important question to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the most interesting conversation I had before I left Bahrain was with a member of the United Nations who was involved, and gosh, I wish I could remember his name, who's involved in this question about money laundering. And his perspective was, and I'll paraphrase it and might misquote it, but I'll get as close as I can, was that the real solution to this nexus of drugs and terrorism is to identify those smuggling partners, the people who own the dhows, and to put them on a counter-terrorism list. So when we do a smuggling, even if we don't arrest anybody, even if we're just throwing the drugs over, if we can identify, and the legal ability to identify these people as terrorists and as aiding and abetting terrorists would ruin their business. Would put them right out of business without putting anybody in prison. But you would take the owner of a bunch of dhows, and so if nobody owns one dhow, they own a bunch of dhows, and so if they're involved in the drug trade and you identify them as involved in the drug trade connected to terrorism, then the ability of everyone in the world to not work with them, to deny them credit anywhere in the world, could put them out of business. And so there's some fascinating work to be done in this field, I think. Yeah.
I agree. Actually, that leads me to another question, if I may. You worked with the Saudi Navy, and I was wondering, because they are heavily involved with financing terrorism in other areas, so was that a challenge at all, or knowing the intelligence that we know?
That's a great question.
And an awkward question.
Yeah, no, it's a fun, you know, I think, and it's funny, this isn't the first chat we got to do. I was in the University of Saskatchewan a couple weeks ago, and we were second-year poli-sci students, and and as I was saying to somebody, they took me to the woodshed and beat me up on questions just like this. And so, and I thought to myself, you know, and I know all of you get this, and that's why you can ask this question. Countries act in their own interests, and sometimes their interests are partially aligned, and sometimes they're not aligned very well at all. And so in the case of Saudi Arabia, I believe that they're acting in their interest to not allow ISIS to be strong, but they're also acting in their interest in other ways to not allow Iran to get stronger. And the exact way, and I don't have intelligence, I don't know that, I'm just reading public source documents like the rest of you, but I believe that they are acting in that way, and that's what we're talking about here. Are they doing things to stop Iran and its surrogates from being stronger? Probably yes, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. Is it uncomfortable? Yeah, it's a bit uncomfortable. I think the same sort of thing happens with Turkey. It happens with Pakistan. It certainly happens with Russia. So when you're working with someone, because your interests are aligned, not all of your interests are aligned. And yeah, it's uncomfortable and it's challenging. But what the other option is not to work with them, and that's worse.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you.
Good question. We have another question from our audience.
Yeah, my name is Ron Gadbois, and I'm an interested retiree. I'm fascinated by the role that you have. It's multifaceted. But one thing you didn't mention was with ISIL and the particular financing for this group. And the Economist seems to think that a big part of it comes from Iraqi oil. And so wouldn't that go through the Straits?
Yeah, my understanding of that trade, and we asked that exact question because we wanted to know, we knew we were going on a counterterrorism mission, so we dug into this before we left. The oil that, my understanding is the oil that's being smuggled out of Iraq and Syria by, out of areas controlled by ISIS, it's being smuggled out in trucks to Turkey. And in fact, there was, Russia just announced today, it was in the Globe and Mail, that they had proof that Turkey was accepting this oil. I don't know whether they do or not. I guess we'll see what proof they actually show. People often say they have proof, but they don't share it. So, but that oil isn't coming out by sea. It's coming out in trucks to Turkey, we think. And then the real question is, I mean, is that the government of Turkey, or is that just, you know, mid-level people who have control of refineries who can accept a certain amount of this and then profit personally from that trade? I don't know, but it's not currently, we don't think we can currently affect it with maritime forces.
No, that's too bad,
Yeah.
because
I agree.
that seems to be where they're getting the money.
Right. I think that, and then my other understanding, and this is all just open source stuff like the rest of us are reading, is that a lot of the financing of ISIS is through the control of that territory that they control, a third of Iraq and a third of Syria, and it's out and out exploitation and taxation of the people who live in that third of each of those countries. And that they're financing a lot of their operation through the control of territory.
A depressing thought. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and I was having a nice night as well, and now we get this. No, I'd like to now it doesn't look like we've got any more questions, so I'd like to ask one of our research fellows to come up and kind of give some final thoughts on the night and to offer a vote of thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name's Eric Jardine. As Aaron mentioned, I'm a research fellow here at CG. It's my honor tonight to first thank both Aaron and Commodore Santarpia for the wonderful discussion, the question and answer, the nice fireside chat, as well as the engaging presentation, and to provide a few thoughts and then a bit of housekeeping at the end. I think, as Commodore Santarpia pointed out, I think that the goal of all these counterterrorism policies, all these counter-piracy policies, is really long-term stability, and that's going to be marked by a combination of both good governance and a limitation on corruption. And both of those objectives are noble, but both of those objectives take a very, very long time to implement. And again, as Commodore Santarpia pointed out in his discussion, the sustained effort needed isn't always matched by, I think, domestic will. And I think talks like this one really fill that gap in a very important way, where we're able to learn about, for example, drug trades, new facets of that, like the smuggling of charcoal, the success of counterterrorism policies, and how that has emerged so successfully where, as it was mentioned, within the last 2 years there have been no successful attacks, and how you have this growing coalition of regional and international partners who are willing to step together to really try to push for stability in the region. And I think that piracy example where the local pirates in Somalia right now, their cost and reward benefit is such that they don't want to do this. But that changes the second you pull out the forces. So I think talks like this really step in and fill that gap so that at least domestically we're having the conversation. We can learn about what the Canadian Navy has been doing, and hopefully that will give us the fortitude to sort of stay on course and continue with these worthwhile efforts. Unfortunately, this is the last public lecture of 2014, or 2015, I should say, but they will be starting up anew in the new year. And there's 3 that are on the books at this stage. There's one in February by Thomas Courtier, who's the managing director of the World Trade Institute and the Institute of European and International Economic Law. There's also another talk in February by CG Senior Fellow Besma Momani, who will be discussing her book Arab Youth and the Demographic Divide. And in March, there's a presentation by Bruce Rydell, who was with the CIA for 30 years, so I'm sure he's going to have interesting stories, and is now at the Brookings Institution, and he's going to be discussing the Iran nuclear deal. So this talk is going to be online within the next 48 hours if you wanted to share that link via social media or if you found it engaging enough to watch it again. And for any of you who found out about this event through colleagues but are not yet on our CG events newsletter, please feel free to register for that. That will give you an automated update of all the coming events that we have in the new year. So with that, I would like you all to join me in a round of applause for Commodore Santarpia and to thank him for his wonderful discussion this evening.
You did a great job.
Civil war in Syria, the events in Iraq, and the tightening of the border in Turkey. And so instead of going overland, the other way it's going to come out, the drug trade is kind of like a balloon. If you squeeze the balloon, it tends to expand where it can somewhere else. And so the drug trade that couldn't go overland has gone down through Pakistan and Iran to the coast and out through the coast to sea. And then the last reason there's more of an increase, more interdictions, is we're getting better at finding it. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game between the smugglers and the people who were working against smugglers, police forces, and militaries in that region, and coast guards. We were getting better at finding it and understanding their modus operandi. But it's a learning game on both sides, and they learn as well. And so while we had massive success in 2014, we didn't have as much success in 2015. This map is intended just to show you where it's actually happening. So this is Afghanistan. That's where the drugs all originate out of. As I said, a lot of it travels over land, but it's harder and harder to get it over land. And so lots of it is smuggled down here through Pakistan and through Iran to this place here called the Makran Coast, where it gets transported into dhows. And so these are all dhows. These are all successful drug busts in 2014. Those dhows, there's hundreds of them off the coast on any given day. And those dhows are there for legitimate reasons. They're what do all the coastal transfers, cargo transfers. They're also the fishing dhows. So there's hundreds of them out there, and they're all there for legitimate reasons, except a few. And those few are
including the HMSC Halifax. Most recently, he was the commanding officer of the HMCS St. John's from January 2007 until July 2008. He's also been active in training other military officers and personnel. He was a navigation instructor. He also was the head of the Warfare Training Division at the Canadian Forces Fleet School. Following his promotion to captain in 2009, he was appointed as the special advisor to the Vice Chief of Defense Staff. In 2010, he assumed command of the Canadian Forces Base in Halifax until 2012. He's also very well educated. Aside from this I would say, wonderful experience in the Navy that's replete with both training and operational missions in every level of command, he was awarded a Bachelor of Commerce from Royal Roads University and a Master's of Defense Study from the Royal Military College. He was promoted to his current rank in July 2013 and was appointed as the Director General of Navy Personnel. And I suppose what brings us here tonight is that from December 2015 until April 2015, he was deployed to Bahrain, where he commanded the Combined Task Force 150, which is that multinational group of ships and aircraft that are actually out there conducting these counter-terrorism operations on the high seas. Upon his return to Canada, he was appointed to his current position as Chief of Staff to the Vice Chief of Defense Staff. So I think it kind of behooves me to say that I think we're very, very lucky to have such a...
Look at the next one here. So if you've ever heard of CTF 150, and many of you will have, because it shows up in the news every once in a while, the thing you hear about is drugs. Every once in a while, there's a big drug bust in the Indian Ocean. If that drug bust happens, it's usually done by a Canadian or an Australian ship. We just happen to be the best at doing that of all of our coalition partners. The drug busts are very large, hits the news, page 4 of the Globe or the National Post, and then it's gone, and you don't remember it. But they're very significant drug busts. This particular bust that you're looking at is over a ton of heroin. It's on the flight deck of Her Majesty's Canadian ship Toronto. They did this particular bust last year east of Africa in the Indian Ocean. And this is happening regularly. The numbers don't matter here at all. The important thing is the secular trend that's going up. And so more and more drugs are being interdicted in the Indian Ocean at sea. And there's a number of reasons why that's happening. The first of those reasons is that all of these drugs, all of this heroin and hash originates from the poppy fields in Afghanistan. And if you're tracking what's happening in Afghanistan, you know that it's not becoming more secure. It's becoming less secure in many areas of Afghanistan. And so the poppy yield, the poppy crop is larger than it has been in years. And terrorist organizations are benefiting more and more from the profits of that crop. Another factor of why there's been more interdictions is that a lot of that crop is almost all of it's headed for Europe, and some of it heads overland and goes through, would have gone through places like Iraq and Syria and Turkey, but it's more and more difficult to smuggle things overland for obvious reasons. Like
A distinguished speaker was someone with such worldly expertise to come and talk to us about such a pressing topic. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Commodore Brian Santarpia.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate that. Thank you. I really appreciate the introduction. We were joking at dinner, and I asked Aaron not to go through all that long list because it just shows I can't keep a job, is what I said. But that being aside, it's a great opportunity to come and speak to you. And the part of the introduction I appreciated the most was Aaron discussing why this is topical, why terrorism is still at front of mind for all of us. The attacks against Paris, the attack in Lebanon, the attack in Turkey, all those are very recent. And so it's not just in Western countries that we see these attacks going on every day, and it's important to note that all the countries of the world are facing this challenge, and that the way we react is in a lot of different ways. And so this talk, we've made this talk in a few different places across the country in the last little while. One, because it's important and topical now. Two, because it's important that Canadians, especially the well-informed Canadians like you are, understand what it is that we're doing on your behalf with your tax dollars and your sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. And three, because we're going to keep doing this kind of work. So this week, Australia will take command of this task force, and in their staff will be 7 Canadians, including the Deputy Commander, Captain Bill Quinn. So this work keeps going on. So it's important that the Canadians, particularly the well-informed Canadians like you, understand what it is we're doing on your behalf.
To CG this evening. My name is Aaron Shull. I'm the Chief of Staff and General Counsel here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. It's not long ago that the terrorist attacks in Paris reminded us that the scourge of terrorism is still very real, and it's incumbent upon us to combat it in every way that we can. Tonight we're very fortunate to welcome Commodore Brian Santarpia, who's going to be speaking to us about the military efforts of the Canadian Navy to help combat terrorism in conjunction with a number of other nations on the high seas. And it's my job tonight to introduce our very, very distinguished speaker. Commodore Santarpia was enrolled in the Canadian Forces in 1986 as a maritime surface officer. After completing his training, he served in a number of different operational postings. He was a bridge watchkeeper, and actually in preparation for this introduction, I learned quite a bit about the different roles in the Navy. So there is something called a bridge watchkeeper. I wanted everyone to know that. He was also a navigator, a combat officer, an executive officer, and he served on a range of different ships,